Okay, so I am very grateful to the organizers of this conference for inviting me. And I mean, in this talk, I will take you through a trip from non-commutative geometry to passing through, if you want, tropical geometry, which will play a very important role, and ending up with, what we call absolute algebraic geometry. So, most of it is joint work with Katia Consani, but let me start from the start. I will begin by explaining the origin coming from non-commutative geometry. How did it arise from a quantum statistical mechanical system, and then how through topos theory and tropical geometry one could endow the scaling site with a geometric structure. And then, I will discuss the Riemann-Roch formula for the periodic orbits. And finally, I will end up with this absolute algebraic geometry. Okay, so if you want, the starting point of this story comes from the fact that when you deal with non-commutative spaces in non-commutative geometry, there is a very strange thing, which is that there is a thermodynamics of non-commutative spaces. They have a canonical time evolution, they are not static objects. And what you can do, this of course arose from the case of foliations, but what you can do is you can look at them at different temperature. And while the primary example was coming from foliations, the example which I will start from, which is quite important, is coming from discrete groups. But when you take a discrete group, in fact, you obtain, when you look at the measure theory, in general you obtain a 2-1 factor. And what the thermodynamics is interesting for type 3. But you obtain type 3 not from a single discrete group, but from a discrete group and a subgroup which is not normal, which is almost normal, in the sense, that when you conjugate, you get finite sets. And when it's almost normal, what you have instead of having a quotient group, what you have really at the operator level, you have an Hecke algebra. Okay, and it turns out that in many interesting situations, this Hecke algebra, when you take the regular representation, it's type 3, so there is thermodynamics. Now, this thermodynamics, if you want, is the tool, the essential tool that we have in non-commutative geometry in order to understand what happens when you try to cool down the space and so on. It is the Kubo-Martin-Schwinger condition. So it's a condition which associates to a state, which is a relation, if you want, between a state, which is supposed to be an equilibrium state, and a one-parameter group of evolution. So I won't enter into the details, but what is really important is that thanks to that, you can indeed start with a space which is non-commutative, look at its time evolution, and then you can change the temperature and look for equilibrium state at a different temperature. And this is what we shall do with a fundamental example. This example comes, as I said just before, by a pair of groups. Now, this pair of groups, it's incredibly simple. It is the affine group of the rationals, where you take the A, the multiplicative piece, to be positive, and the subgroup, which is almost normal, it's not normal, but it's almost normal, is a group of integer translations. So you take this pair, then, as I said, it turns out that there is a regular representation for this pair, there is a Hecke algebra of taking class functions and convolution. And when you look at the regular representation, you find that it's type 3. In fact, it's type 3-1. And it gives a system which we call the BC system, because I discovered it in the 90s with Jean-Benoît Bost. And this system has a thermodynamics. And its thermodynamics is amazingly interesting because it exhibits a phenomenon which is well known in physics, in physical systems. When, for instance, you take a ferromagnet, when the temperature is high enough, there is one equilibrium state where everything is sort of, random. And then when you cool it down, then it turns out the ferromagnets align with each other in some direction, which is unspecified, so there is what is called spontaneous symmetry breaking. And here in the BC system, this is the same thing which happens. So as soon as you begin to cool it down from the temperature, which is sort of the one which is natural from the system, then what you find out is that there is no longer one equilibrium state, KMS state, but there is a whole family of KMS states, and they are indexed by something which is a very simple Shimura variety, which, okay, as we shall see, you know, is very explicit. And so what happens now is that amazingly, this spontaneous symmetry breaking, which comes from physics, is intimately related to the Galois symmetry. Because what happens is that the system has natural symmetries, symmetries which are given, if you want, by the group of invertible elements in the final completion of Z. And this symmetry is, of course, spontaneously broken by the equilibrium states at lower temperature. And now what happens is that when you look really at equilibrium state at 0 temperature, so you go all the way, then it turns out that when you evaluate these equilibrium states on a natural subalgebra of the Eck algebra, which is things which have integral coefficients, then you find that the values of the state are algebraic numbers. And they are algebraic numbers which give you exactly the cyclotomic extension of Q. You know, this well-known extension where you have the Kronecker theorem that it contains every abelian extension of Q. So, I mean, then what happens is that somehow, if you want, the Galois ambiguity, which is coming from the fact that we don't know how to distinguish between roots of an equation, is exactly the same as the physical ambiguity which is obtained from the symmetry breaking. And when you look at the way you pass from one to the other, if you want, from using the isomorphism, then you obtain exactly the class field theory isomorphism. So somehow this system has this very peculiar property that it relates very concretely the physical system and the equilibrium state at 0 temperature, I mean the symmetry breaking, with the Galois ambiguity and the class field theory isomorphism. Okay, so of course this system was very interesting from the start, but when it really became much more interesting was when with Jean Benoit, what we found out is that the partition function of this system, when you compute it, okay, there is a definition of a partition function of a quantum statistical mechanical system, and when you compute this partition function, you find the Riemann zeta function. Now, so once you have that, you can wonder, I mean, is it really interesting for the Riemann zeta function to have it appearing as a partition function of a quantum system? I mean, because after all, the partition function, a priori, you are only interested in the real values of the parameter, positive real values of the parameter, which is the inverse temperature. But in fact, what turned out to be the case is that it sort of easily gave the spectral realization of the zeros of the Riemann zeta function as an absorption spectrum. So, I mean, it gave a space, first of all, and that space, of course, is non-commutative because this was the whole story from the start. So it's a space which is, if you want, the dual in the sense of the type 3 to type 2 relation to the original BC system. And so it's a system which can be concretely associated to a space, if you want, and that space is a double coset space. It is a quotient of the adels of Q. On the one hand, you divide by something very mild, which is a compact group, which is the maximal compact subgroup of the Edel class group, which is very simple. But on the other side, you divide it by Q cross. And of course, you had to divide by Q cross to act by Edel classes, otherwise you couldn't. But when you divide by Q cross, what you get is a space which is very wide, very difficult, even at the measure theory level. And because the action of Q cross is ergodic, in fact, on these adels. So, I mean, you obtain a typical non-commutative space, very much like a leaf space and so on. And the interesting part was not so much, when I discovered that, I mean, it was not so much the fact that you get the spectral realization, okay, I mean, that was, no, what was really interesting was that you get, so of course the spectral realization also, it was, as an absorption spectrum, so you have this these three types of spectra. You have the full spectrum on the upper part, and you have the full spectrum here. Here you have the emission spectrum, which is a few bright lines on a dark background, and finally you have what we have here, which is an absorption spectrum, which is in fact what we see in physics. I mean, in physics, what you see when you look at the light coming from the sun, you see that there are missing lines. So it is exactly this way that the spectrum was realized. But what was much more interesting than that was the fact that it was giving geometric interpretation to the explicit formulas of Riemann-Weil. And I mean, the way it occurs is extremely simple to explain, in the sense that it's really, if you want, the scaling. So the action is the scaling on the Delta space, and the fact that the scaling gives you the correct Weil terms, I mean, which are typically what you see here. The fact that it gives you the correct Weil terms is a very simple calculation of the trace of the kernel of the scaling. I mean, it's just a very simple change of variables. There are plenty of subtleties here, in which I won't enter at the moment, but I mean, it gave this quite nice input that somehow there was a natural space whose study would be rewarding as far as understanding the explicit formula, the zeros of zeta, and so on and so forth. And one thing, so that which we found with Katia Consani when we started working, was that in fact there was, using this space, there was a way to understand the complete Riemann zeta function exactly by a Hasse-Weil formula. So if you remember, I mean, in the case of function fields, the Hasse-Weil formula is obtained by defining a function using the counting, the number of points of the curve that you consider over an extension of the finite field of some degree. And then what you do is you write this generating function for this counting function, and with some work you find that you have the analog of the Riemann zeta function in that case. Now, Christophe Soulet proposed a formula when q goes to 1, and this formula was used in very simple situations to if you want, do the analogous counting. But in the formula of Soulet, one has to use the counting function. There it was just a polynomial for all values of q. And what we found with Katia is that in fact one can transform the formula of Soulet, which was taking a limit, into a formula which no longer takes a limit but really takes an integral. Because the limiting process of Soulet was in fact exactly computing the Riemann sums for a Riemann integral. So then out of this formula we devised a formula which was no longer a limit but which was an integral. And then we were puzzled because we were saying, okay, well, I mean, if there is a replacement of a curve which plays a good role with respect to the Riemann zeta function, then we should be able to find the counting function that replaces the counting function in the case of function fields, and which now uses an integral rather than a sum. Okay, and so I mean we wrote down, if you want, the ansatz, which was this ansatz that was supposed to determine the counting function n of u, so that you would get the, I mean, on the left hand side you have the logarithmic derivative of the complete Riemann zeta function, because of course you replace the exponential by taking the logarithmic derivative. Okay, so we were wondering on that, and okay, by looking at the explicit formula, we found the distribution. We found that it was not a function, but it was a distribution. Okay, of course, I mean, this should be expected because we are in a more subtle case. So it's a distribution, and we were quite pleased to see that this distribution actually was positive. The fact that it is positive is not obvious, because this distribution is in fact the derivative of a function which is increasing. And when you look at the graph of this function which is increasing, this is the way it looks. I mean, it's well, we have also a formula for this function in terms of the zeros of the Riemann zeta function. But what you don't see on the picture is that when you go near the point 1, this function in fact shoots down to minus infinity. And this accounts for the fact that the Euler characteristic of the hypothetical curve should be equal to minus infinity. So, I mean, there were plenty of subtle points, but what was very rewarding, what was really very reassuring, if you want, in this story, was that, in fact, this counting is taking place on our space. It's taking place on the space of adult classes. And and the reason why it's taking place on this space of adult classes was that when you look carefully, you find out that the reason why one was obtaining, if you want, the explicit formula of Riemann-Weil on the adult class space is exactly what is needed in order to prove that if you look at the scaling and that suitable notion of fixed points and so on, you will actually obtain the counting function, n of u, which is the distribution, in fact. So, this was very reassuring. It was telling us that somehow the space, even though it's a non-commutative space, which is a very subtle space, if you want, seems to be the right one. At least it seems to be a very good candidate for a space which is intimately related to the Riemann zeta function. Okay, so that was the situation. And, but then, we had a big step which we crossed with Katia Kanzani in 2014. And the big step was that before, the space we were considering, people who don't know commutative geometry should, they were all, of course, as usual, tempted to say, well, okay, it's a non-commutative space, so we don't know what it is. Well, the amazing fact that we discovered with Katia Kanzani is that, in fact, this space is, in fact, exactly the space of points of a topos. And this topos, it's very hard to do simpler than that. Of course, it shouldn't be trivial. But, what is a topos? We call it the scaling site, if you want, or the scaling topos, if you want. What is it? It's a topos which, in fact, should be very natural to every musician, because it's a topos where you have the positive line, the line of frequencies, and you know very well that when you do music, okay, when you multiply a frequency by 2, you go to the next octave, and it's very nice for the ear. When you multiply by 3/2, okay, you go to you transpose and so on. So, the action of the integers by multiplication on the frequencies is extremely natural. So the topos that we took with Katia is, and I will explain how we were driven to that, is in fact the half line, the positive, semi-direct product with n cross. So this is topos. And when you compute the point of this topos, which is not easy, okay, it's a nice problem, you find that it's, very canonically isomorphic to the previous space. To this space of adult classes where you have this double quotient, where you have this thing. So, this discovery, if you want, of the link with the topos led Katia and myself to find the missing structure on the space that we had discovered from non-commutative geometry. And that missing structure it's a geometric structure, and but it's not enough to have the topos, if you want. What you need is, of course, when you do geometry, you don't have just a space. You have a space plus a structure sheaf on this space. And it turns out that this is where the link with tropical geometry will begin. Namely, what we found is that, in fact, the structure sheaf of this topos, which is naturally arising, is of tropical nature. And what we have understood with Katia, and I will explain why, is that, in fact, the correct way that, from our point of view, from number theory, we think about this structure is characteristic 1. So by characteristic 1, I mean the following. Remember that Q was tending to 1 before when we were looking at things. And here, of course, if you say that 1 is equal to 0, okay, you are nowhere, of course, because, everything collapses. But you should replace 1 equals 0 by 1 plus 1 is equal to 1. And that will do the job. That will do the job. So how did it arise? It arose, if you want, it arose in steps. The first thing was to understand that, semi-rings are, in fact, extremely natural. And the reason why they are extremely natural, you should know, for instance, that when you know, people talk about an abelian category. An abelian category, in fact, you don't need to put an additional structure in order to define an abelian category, because in fact the addition of morphisms is something which follows from the general properties of the category, of just as a category. And semi-rings arose extremely naturally in that setup. I mean, there is in fact an exercise in the book of MacLean where this is sort of implicit. So, I mean, what happens is that the only thing that you need to know is that in the category, if you want, is that the natural map which goes from the coproduct to the product is in fact an isomorphism. And if you have that just from abstract nonsense, then you will find out that if you look at endomorphisms of an object of the category, then it's automatically a semi-ring. So, you know, it turns out that this observation somehow leads very far, and I mean, then, you know, the first thing that you have to do when you extend your ideas from ordinary rings to semi-rings, you have to ask the basic questions. And there is a basic question which is well explained at the beginning of Weil's book, which is called, you know, which is on the fundamental of arithmetic, I mean, basic arithmetics. And if you look at this book of Weil, you will find that he starts by proving that the only finite fields are what we know. Okay, I mean, you know, they have Qs. Now, you can ask the questions, what are the finite semifields? Semifields. And it's quite a nice exercise, which I recommend, I mean, not to look in books, I mean, do it yourself, to find out that there is only one exception. So there is only one semifield, which is finite and which is not a field. And what is this semifield? It is what we call the Boolean semifield. So it's formed of two elements, 0 and 1, and it has exactly these properties that I was mentioning. Of course, the product, 0 times anything is 0, and 1 times anything is that thing. So, I mean, the product is obvious. And the addition, 0 plus x is x, for any x. But now, 1 plus 1 is 1, okay? And this is the only exception. So that's already something. That's already something. So we know that there is not much else, okay, than the ordinary stuff. But there is much more than that. I mean, now what you have a lemma, which you know, which tells you that you have the analog of the Frobenius in characteristic 1, but you have a Frobenius for each integer. So what you have is that if you take a semifield of characteristic 1, then for any integer, the operation of replacing x by x to the power n is additive. I mean, it's an endomorphism. It's not completely trivial to prove, and moreover, it's injective. And what you find out is that there is only one semi-ring of characteristic 1 whose multiplicative group is just infinite cyclic. I mean, you know, so I mean, okay, so all these things, they work beautifully. They are very understandable and so on. And what you find out, okay, of course, you might say, okay, I don't have enough structure and so on. No, but I mean, for instance, what we did a long time ago with Katja, we showed how to reconstruct the ordinary addition from semifield using the Witt construction. So you have a lot of stuff. And I mean, the first object that we discovered, that we were analyzing with Katja, is the arithmetic side. So what is the arithmetic side? Now, the topos could hardly be simpler. It is the multiplicative integers acting on a point. So if you want, it is a presheaf topos, and it's a topos of presheaves on the small category which has only one object and whose endomorphisms are the multiplicative integers. And of course, now when you give a sheaf on this topos, you are just giving an object in some category with an action of n cross. And of course, I mean, lambda rings are a typical example of that. But here, what we do for the arithmetic side, we take as a structure sheaf the integers, I mean the max, which is the only semi-ring with a multiplicative structure, is infinite cyclic. And so, okay, I mean, it is well known, of course, in tropical geometry. It is just the integers where you take the max as a sum, except that you adjoin the minus infinity, which will play the role of the neutral element for the addition. And the multiplication now becomes the addition. Okay, so I mean, this Z max turns out, because of the general fact that any semi-field, it is a semi-field, of course, that any semi-field has a Frobenius for each integer, it comes naturally equipped as a sheaf over the topos n at cross. Okay, so I mean, this was our starting point. And when we studied this object, we were quite surprised because, as I said, you know, when you have a characteristic one, you have a lot going on for you, because you have this base, which is this only semi-field of characteristic one, which is finite, okay, which is the Boolean semi-field. And you also have this very nice extension, which is the reals, I mean the tropical real numbers, if you want, which we prefer to denote multiplicatively. So where you have the max again, and you have ordinary multiplication. And now the remarkable fact is that the Galois group of this semi-field, namely if you want, the group of automorphisms of this extension of B, because of course it contains B, is formed of the group R plus star. So this is very enticing, because it tells us that before, remember, we had the action of scaling, which was also an action of R plus star. And I mean, now this R plus star appears as a Galois group. So of course it's extremely tempting to try to understand our previous construction of the Adelka space and so on, and the action of scaling, to understand it in a much more geometric manner, and to understand it as an action of the Galois group on the points of a suitable space. Now, what is this space? It is simply the arithmetic side. So what turns out to be the case is that if you take the arithmetic side, okay, which is defined over B, and you look, as you do in algebraic geometry, you look for its points over this R plus max, over this extension. Then, okay, one can define what they are. I mean, it's very natural to define what they are. I mean, and of course, I mean, this will be related to the point of the topos, but it will also be related to the fact that you take points with value somewhere. And we have a theorem. And this theorem, which is the first important fact, if you want, is that somehow when you look for these points, you find exactly the previous Adelka space. And moreover, the action of the scaling, which we considered before, which was used for the explicit formulas, which was used for the spectral realization, is nothing else but the action of the Galois group on the points. So it's, you know, extremely parallel to the situation which occurs in the case of a curve. And I mean, it's encouraging. It's encouraging. But then, okay, we wanted to go further with Katia. And what we wanted to do, so of course, this is the actual situation, okay? I mean, you can see, and I should have mentioned that there is a map, natural map from spec Z to the arithmetic side, okay? And okay, and now we look at the points, and we have this Adelka space, but we wanted more. I mean, there is this beginning of a dictionary where you have the arithmetic side on the right-hand side, and you have the ordinary geometric notions on the left-hand side, and you have, okay, I mean, but, okay, we wanted more, because we wanted to have, if you want, a geometric interpretation of this action of R plus star as correspondences. Now, this was not obvious at all, because remember that the arithmetic side is a very delimitable object. I mean, it's a completely discrete object. So how could you know, define an action of R plus star on this object? I mean, it doesn't look at all possible. But it turns out to be possible thanks to the geometric idea of a correspondence. And I mean, the way it occurs is like this. I mean, you can understand, of course, I don't want to go into the details, but you can understand what is going on by looking at this picture. This picture is like the square of the arithmetic side. And the correspondence will correspond to certain subsets, and these subsets will be dictated by a slope. And I mean, while, you know, when the slope is rational, you can have an immediate idea of this, it turns out that the irrational slopes also define a correspondence. And then you can work out this correspondence, you can work out what is the composition of correspondences and so on, and they correspond to a positive real number. And now they are really geometric. And when you do that, you prove a theorem, which is that they compose, this correspondence is composed in the right way. So they compose in the right way. There is a subtlety which is coming from the fact that, you know, sometimes you can have two irrational numbers whose product is rational, and in that case there is a real subtlety which arises. But I found it, I mean, we found it very surprising, if you want, and very convincing, that there was a way out of something completely discrete to obtain these correspondences, and they fitted exactly with the framework that we had. Okay, so then of course, you know, it's very natural then to continue to define divisors, define intersection of divisors, and so on. So this, okay, I mean, this is difficult because of the type of formulas that one obtains, and then, okay, I mean, one can reformulate RH as one does in the case of a curve by a certain inequality of the square of the divisor corresponding to combinations of the Frobenius correspondences that I talked about before. An inequality like you have, if you want, in the Matuk-Tate-Grothendieck approach in the case of curves. So one can do that, but somehow, you know, there was one key question which arose in this business, which is that, okay, when you take a curve, you can do two things, and these two things should give you the same result. You can take the point of the curve over a field extension, so you can do that, but you can also extend scalars for the curve, and then look at points in a more naive way of the curve after extending scalars. And so what we did with Katja, we formulated this problem, if you want, and then what we did was to indeed extend scalars from the arithmetic side. And in order to do that, what we did was to, you know, of course, do it at the algebraic level, namely we took the max and we took the tensor product, I mean, over B with R max and so on, and then we looked at the corresponding points and so on. And this is where we discovered the scaling side. So what we found out, if you want, is that in fact the scaling side came up completely automatically. I mean, there was no, you know, fudging around or anything like that. It came out completely naturally from the extension of scalars of the arithmetic side, passing, if you want, to R max, and then, if you want, the result is even more striking than when I was talking about the points defined over R plus max, because now we have a topos. Okay, we just have a topos. And one can ask, okay, what are the points of this topos? Of course, I mean, we expect them to give the same result as before. And this was what was very surprising. I mean, what was very surprising is that now this topos, which is the scaling side, if you want, which is the semi-direct product of 0 infinity by n cross, does give us exactly the same thing as what we had before when we were taking the points defined over R plus max. So, okay, so we have some confidence, if you want, in the geometric framework. And but now what do we gain by having extended scalars? Well, you see, when we have extended scalars, there is a big plus. The big plus is that now, unlike it was the case when we were taking points defined over R plus max, now we have a natural extension of the structure sheaf. And when we computed the structure sheaf of the scaling side, so after extending scalars, what we found was very, very pleasant. Because what we found was exactly, if you want, the sheaf of functions, that, if you want, you would get at when you do Newton polygons and so on. So I will skip that. I mean, when you do Newton polygons, I mean, you can do Newton polygons in periodic geometry, but you can also do the same thing when you work in complex analysis. And when you do complex analysis, what you find is typical of the Jensen's theorem, if you want, of that type of formula, the Jensen formula for, the formula that counts the number of zeros and so on. And so now the situation is like this. Situation is now, if you want, the scaling site acquires a structure sheaf. This structure sheaf, what is it? Well, it is exactly of tropical nature because it is formed of convex functions, but they are piecewise affine, and moreover, they have integral slope. Okay, so that's a sheaf, and it's a sheaf which is compatible with the action of n cross. Okay, and now, so if you want, so this is a basic structure. This is the basic structure that we have, and of course, when you have such a basic structure, I mean, remember that the base is a very tricky topos because it's a topos whose points form a non-commutative space. So what we did with Katia, I mean, okay, so this is, if you want, the global picture. If you want, well, you have spec Z, you have the arithmetic site, you have this extension, which is a scaling site, and then you have the picture on the right, okay, which is perfectly compatible, which is in analysis. I mean, where you take, the Adel class space and so on and so forth. But what we did with Katia was we concentrated on periodic orbits. So what are the periodic orbits? It turns out, if you want, that one way to think about the points of the scaling site, besides some points which belong to the arithmetic site by itself, per se, if you want, the other points, you can think of them as being rank 1 subgroups of the real line. Now, it might surprise you that rank 1 subgroups of the real line form a non-commutative space, but if you think about it, you will find that this is correct. I mean, of course, when I say rank 1, I don't mean groups which are free abelian, Z. I mean, it can be a group in which two elements have, a common multiple. I mean, and this is what I mean by rank 1. Okay, and it turns out that the periodic orbits, what do they correspond to in this picture? They correspond to the subgroups of R. They are associated to each prime, first of all, and this is the way we are getting the maps from spec Z. So they are associated to each prime, and to each prime, what corresponds to each prime? Well, it is, if you want, the subgroups of R, which are isomorphic abstractly to the group of rational numbers whose denominator is the power of this prime. Okay, so that's what we get. That's what we get. And why do they form a periodic orbit? Well, they form a periodic orbit because when you multiply by p, okay, I mean, it closes. Okay, I mean, so in fact, I mean, what I mean is that these subgroups, they have an automorphism which is multiplication by p. So I mean, what happens is that you fold the line by p. So they are rescaled from each other. But what happens is that as a set, if you want, they form the quotient of the positive reals by powers of p. So that's very much, even from the start, in the spirit of the Tate formulation of elliptic curves when you are working over periodic numbers. But here, we take r plus star and we divide by p to the z. Okay, so we looked at what happens when we restrict our structure to this periodic orbit. And I mean, what we discovered gradually is that more and more, this was more and more analogous to Jacobi type of elliptic curve. But the great surprise that I will explain, it's not the same as elliptic curves that you get in tropical geometry for the following reason, that in fact what we found with Katia is that the degree and the Riemann-Roch theorem, the degree takes real values. So I mean the degree of divisor will actually give you arbitrary real numbers. And the Riemann-Roch theorem will involve real numbers. So that's really the new feature with respect to the ordinary vision that one could have of an elliptic curve, if you want. in tropical sense. So the way it happens then is that you look at it closely and you find that this periodic orbit, okay, it's r plus star divided by powers of p. It has a sheaf of periodic convex piecewise affine functions, and their slopes now, because of the topos and so on, their slopes belongs to this subgroup. Namely, they are no longer integers, but they are, if you want, with rational numbers with a denominator which is the power of p. And the sheaf of rational functions now, when you look at it, well, what you have is no longer, of course, functions which are convex, but what you find is a sheaf of continuous piecewise affine functions, and their slope also belongs to HP. And it turns out that, you know, by working, okay, you can develop the analog of all the usual way of thinking that we have when we take an elliptic curve. Of course, I mean, you know, this is very parallel to the situation in tropical geometry, but it's not the same, as I insist on saying. And so what you have, you of course, you know, you replace the structure sheaf. I mean, you invert elements. This is what allows you to talk about rational functions. So I mean, because the operation was addition, when you invert, it's like putting minus signs, and so you no longer have convex functions. You have combination like that, and you can talk about Cartier divisors. And when you talk about Cartier divisor, you find exactly, you know, what one does in tropical geometry in order to define the order of a function at a point. And now what is really interesting is that when you use this completely natural notion of order, which is coming from the idea of Cartier divisor, you remember that Cartier divisor is something where you take of course, the rational functions, not the structure sheaf, and then you divide by the elements which were invertible in the original structure sheaf, which here would correspond to affine functions. So you sort of neglect, if you want, affine functions near a point. And so there is a kink, of course, and this is what you measure. This is how you measure, if you want, the divisor at a point, which is familiar in tropical geometry. So you do that. You have this. Then you have a completely natural notion of divisor, and what you find is that the value of a divisor at a point is really an element of the group which represents the point. So I mean, this is a kind of a tautological. And so they form an abelian group, of course, because you can add them. And you have the partial order of divisor, as you have ordinarily, because these groups are ordered groups. And now the degree, of course, is defined as the sum of the values of the divisor, but as an element of R, as an element of the reals. And what was most surprising is that this is surjective on the reals. So it's not like in ordinary case, if you want, where the degree is something discrete. The degree is now continuous valued. And of course, I mean, this is extremely reminiscent of the continuous dimension of Murray and von Neumann, and it is related. Okay, and so there is a notion of principal divisor, because you have the global sections, I mean, the sheaf of rational functions, so you have principal divisors, okay? And when you look at the principal divisor, of course, I mean, this is very important, you find that its degree is 0. So the total of the order, if you want, at each point is 0. And this ensures for you that you will have a map, the degree will be a map from divisors to, I mean, divisor classes, modulo principal divisors, of course, okay? So all of that goes fine. But it turns out that there is an additional invariant. So if you want, you cannot know a divisor by its degree, I mean, okay, fortunately. And this additional invariant is coming from the fact that you have a p minus 1 which enters, and you have this very small, you know, exact sequence that you have here, that you have a z modulo p minus 1 z, which appears when you play with divisors. And you have now the theorem. The theorem is that if you look at the degree together with this additional invariant, then you have a full isomorphism of the divisor classes with the product of R, coming from the degree, with this z modulo p minus 1 z. And okay, I mean, and then you can do the parallel with elliptic curve, but it's very surprising. It's not at all, if you want, like one does normally, because of this fact that the degree is now real valued. Okay, and okay, so what we have found also, of course, I mean, since you want elliptic functions, you want theta functions. And so we have a formula for the theta function, which is simply the transposition of the formula of Tate, if you want, that you have in the Tate formulation of elliptic functions. And so when we transport it, when we transport this formula, we have a formula which is in terms of sums instead of products, so it's infinite sums instead of infinite products. And okay, you can play with these things and so on, and you find out exactly the analog. But there is something now totally new with respect to the usual stuff, which is that, you know, because the dimension will be a real number, when you will compute the dimension of H0, it cannot be done so simply. And it cannot be done so simply because when you do tropical geometry and when we work in this framework, the natural dimension is really a kind of topological dimension. I mean, you count the number of parameters on which a solution to some equation is actually depending. And this is the natural notion of dimension. But of course, this gives you an integer. This gives you an integer. So how on earth are we going to obtain a real number if we are only manipulating integers? And that's exactly where the von Neumann idea, if you want, of the continuous dimensions is entering the scene. And I mean, it enters the scene because somehow it turns out that when you look at H0, namely global sections of a bundle and so on, it turns out that there is now a natural filtration of this H0, which is p-adic. And why I call it p-adic? I call it p-adic because remember that the slopes of the various pieces of the function that were affine, piecewise affine, these slopes were with a denominator which is the power of p. And the filtration will come from these slopes, which are, then, okay, the fact that if you want, you have a discreteness of HP, not in R, I mean, HP is dense in R, but HP is discrete in QP times R. And it is this discreteness which plays a key role. And using this discreteness, then you can define a natural filtration of H0, okay. And then you can define the dimension as a suitable limit, I mean a normalized limit, if you want, of the dimensions. And our main result in this analysis, if you want, of the periodic orbits with Katia was the theorem that, which is giving you a Riemann-Roch formula. And this Riemann-Roch formula is, of course, real valued now, because the dimension is real valued and the degree is real valued. And there is no way you can, you know, play with integers and so on and replace these real valued dimensions by integers. I mean, they are there once and for all. So using the topological dimension, using this limiting process, which, as I said, is in fact quite related to the von Neumann dimension. I mean, I won't explain that, but I mean, it is a shadow, if you want. It's a little bit like Newton polygons and so on. It's a shadow of a von Neumann dimension. But out of that, if you want, we have a Riemann-Roch formula, a Riemann-Roch theorem. Now, okay, this is nice because it's a periodic orbits and so on, but it's quite far from the true problem. And the true problem, I mean, back to the goal, what we would like to have, if we wanted to imitate Matteuch-Tate-Grothendieck method, would be to look at Riemann-Roch on the square. Because I remind you, I mean, you know that if you want to, what you have to prove is a certain inequality, or if you want to prove that a certain self-intersection of a divisor and so on is coming from the Frobenius correspondence satisfies some inequality. But now you have to fight with the square of the scaling site. And when you are on the square of the scaling side, what we were not able to do with CATIA, which is an open problem if you want, we are not able to reach a good definition and a good notion of H1. I mean, of course, you can, for H2, you can play with third duality, so there is no problem with H2. The problem is H1. Problem is H1, and so what we did with CATIA, we wrote a long paper on the homological algebra in characteristic 1, but which was okay, finding a lot of nice stuff and so on, but we didn't succeed in finding the analog of H1. And we knew also from some counterexamples that it was not really possible if you want to play with sections in the same way as one was playing in the ordinary case. So I mean, this was a huge question, a huge open question. And I mean, by analyzing this question, by brooding about this question and so on, we were led, in fact, to a basis for doing geometry, which is under the B, under this Boolean field B, and which is also under any finite field. And I mean, this basis is somehow, if you want, it's a common basis to all the various characteristics. And we call it absolute algebraic geometry. In fact, it is intimately related to the sphere spectrum. And I mean, it goes back, one should say, I mean, it goes back to essentially to the algebraic case of Waldhausen and to the beginning of the 80s. And I remember, hearing a talk in Oberwolfach by Goodwillie. We had an Oberwolfach session in the 80s about cyclic homology, and Goodwillie was there. And I was quite impressed to hear Goodwillie saying that, the ring Z is not the most fundamental ring. And I mean, we know that, of course. I mean, we know that, when you take Z tensor over Z with Z, you get Z. So, I mean, it cannot be the fundamental ring. Now, what Goodwillie was explaining was that if you work in the world of spectra, spectra in the sense of topologist, okay, then it turns out that there are ring spectra, there is a ring spectrum which is more fundamental than the integers. And the integers form an algebra over it. And this ring spectrum corresponds to the sphere spectrum. Now, what we have done with CATIA is we have, if you want, we have taken this idea and we have used the incarnation of this idea, which has been found by Graham Siegel a long time ago, but which has been put in good terms by some ideas of Lidakis, which allowed to, if you want, to give to the smash product, which is essential here, a good formulation, which is not just, associative up to something. No, it's associative on the nose, it's well defined, and so on. Moreover, the objects of the categories that we are using with CATIA are extremely simple to define. So let me give you the idea rather than some technicalities about this new category. So it's a new category in which you replace abelian groups. So I mean, we shall extend the idea of an abelian group. And then it will be very easy to extend what is the idea of a ring and so on and so forth. So how do we extend the idea of an abelian group? Well, we extend it like this. Imagine that you lend me an abelian group. Let's call it H. Okay. Now I will do something. I will forget about this abelian group for a while, and I will replace it by the functor, which to a set X associates the divisors with values in H. Okay, so for instance, we can take X to be finite. Why not, Okay, I mean, this would be the simplest. So let's look at the functor, which to a finite set, pointed if you need it, associates the divisors on X with values in H. And on the point, you take the value 0, let's say. Okay, so these are the divisors on X. Now, the only properties that we retain from this functor, so it's a functor from sets to sets, I mean, from finite pointed sets to pointed sets. Okay. The only properties that we want to retain on this functor is that it's covariant. Why is it covariant? Okay, well, it's covariant because if I have a divisor on the set X and I have a map f from X to Y, and if I take a point of Y and I want to know what is the value of the divisor there, I can take the preimage of this point Y, and I can take the sum of the values of the divisors on the preimage. That makes sense because, you know, the divisor is finite. So, I mean, that makes sense. And what does it mean? It means that I have used in a very simple manner the addition in the group H in order to obtain this functor. Well, first thing that you see is that, of course, it would work also if instead of having a group, I had a semigroup. I mean, you know, this would work exactly the same way. So that's what you have. You have this functor. Now, you have to think a bit, but if you think a bit, you will find out that, in fact, you don't lose anything in doing that. Namely that if I would hand you this functor, you would recover the group, or you would recover the semigroup and so on. But, as turns out to be the case, this notion is more general. Namely, you can have functors which are covariant and which are functors from finite pointed sets to pointed sets, but which are not coming from a group or a semigroup. And what is the most basic example? The most basic example is the identity functor. The identity functor associates to a finite set the corresponding finite set itself as a pointed set. It's covariant, obviously, okay? And now, amazingly, you know, it is smaller than any other. And now, thanks to these ideas of Lidakis, I mean, of using what is called the day convolution or the day product, I mean, there is a natural, if you want, how to say, tensor category structure on these S modules. So these things which generalize abelian groups are called S modules. Okay, there is a natural tensor category structure on them. And then, of course, you have a notion of algebra, of rings there. Now, the category of ordinary rings embeds faithfully in that new category. You don't lose anything, okay? Okay, the category of monoids also embeds completely faithfully. And I mean, in one previous paper with Katja, we had used an idea of Cartier, of combining together the category of monoids with the category of commutative rings. And it turns out that when they are embedded very naturally in there, this new category, which looked a little bit artificial, becomes totally natural. It becomes on the nose, if you want, the subcategory formed of these objects. So then what happens is that you can consider Z, and you can consider the tensor product of Z by Z over S, over this base, and you find that it's not equal to Z. First point, very important point. And what we have done with Katja, we have written a paper which develops algebraic geometry over this new base. But the beauty is the following. The beauty is that somehow, if you want, you can, what you find out is that all the examples of extensions of the ordinary theory of rings, which were here and there before, they all become special cases of this new theory of S modules. And the final result on which I will finish will be coming back to the start. And coming back to the start by the following statement, which I find, you know, which we found with Katja, and which is really somehow the conclusion of my talk, I mean, which is that what you do, you take this S, which is this absolute base, okay? You take its algebraic closure. So this algebraic closure is obtained, in fact, by adjoining roots of unities. There is a notion of algebraic closure. This notion of algebraic closure means simply that you can diagonalize any matrix. I mean, you know, in a suitable way. You can form the normal form. So, I mean, so it has this property. So there is this extension which we call S bar. Now, what you do, you apply the Witt construction to this S bar. And you know what you find? you know what you find. So this Witt extension has a Frobenius, it has a Verschiebung, exactly as in the ordinary case. And you find the starting point, you find the BC system. So the BC system is nothing else but the Witt construction done on the algebraic closure of this universal algebraic base which we have discovered. So okay, so I think I will end here. Okay, thank you.